The topic today is about guilt and shame. Shame is a killer. Oftentimes it goes unnoticed. It is an example someone once told me. It is about as kids when you pull some prank and you're running through a backyard at night, not able to see the clotheslines in that backyard. And it doesn't take too many times of running through that dark backyard and getting caught on the neck in one of those clotheslines to realize you better understand where those clotheslines are. Shame and guilt are clotheslines across the backyard of our journey of recovery. And we really need to understand what they are. We need to understand how they affect our lives. We need to understand that they are choices, and indeed we have the power to make new and different and better choices. Guilt and shame is the topic of our talk today. Why guilt and shame? Because I suppose along with fear and low self-esteem and various kinds of issues, but guilt and shame is a primary problem for recovering people. Guilt and shame needs to be understood in order that we can confront it so that it does not become the mud on the window, keeping the beautiful light of God's love and our own possibility out of the house in which we live. Guilt and shame easily become killers. All right, now, let's define what we're talking about. First of all, let me define shame, because guilt is the feeling that comes from shame. Shame is a state of being. It's a basic assumption that we live in. Guilt is the feeling that comes from that. So a definition of shame, a definition that I have found least helpful in understanding shame, it is the basic assumption that I am inadequate and flawed, and therefore I do not deserve any happiness or success beyond that which I already have. Now, I know that's a bit long, so let's think about that and take it apart. Shame is the basic assumption. It's more than just an attitude. It's more than a feeling. It's more than a behavior. It's imprinted in the core of who I am. It's my fundamental way that I have learned to define myself. And that basic assumption is that there is something wrong with me. The basic assumption of a shame-based person is that I am inadequate and flawed. Somehow, some way, I missed the train as far as when the good stuff was handed out. Now, since none of us can outperform our own basic assumptions, if we think we can't, we won't. If we think we can, we can. No one can outperform their own basic assumptions. Since that is true, a person who has internalized a negative basic assumption must therefore necessarily translate that into failure. And that's why a shame-based person cannot acquire any happiness or success beyond that which they already have, because the locomotive pulling the train is going in the wrong darn direction. Now, what are your basic assumptions? If shame is that basic assumption and guilt is the feeling that springs from that assumption, when we get into behaviors where we're reaching for what we don't think we deserve, what might those basic assumptions be? What I would ask you to do, again with paper and pencil if at all possible, or at least discussing this later on, let me share with you some of the most common ways that we have internalized this shame or these negative basic assumptions. And what I might ask you to do, again on a score of 1 to 10, for example, just to focus this, to make it more real in our life. 1 means I don't relate to this. 10 means, boy, you must have lived in my house. How did you know that? So the 10s that I am going to list for you translate into very negative basic assumptions. And that's where the shame comes from. That's what a shame-based person is. Someone who is walking around with all of these negative definitions of themselves, acting accordingly because we can't act any other way, and of course, therefore, feeling terribly guilty about it, about everything. All right, number one, universal criticism. That I lived with being criticized about everything. Nothing I ever did was good enough. If I got 4 hits at a baseball game, by God, what I'd hear every time I got home. What about that 5th time? And even if I did go 5 for 5, what I'd hear when I came home is, pitcher must have been lousy. Or if you cleaned the house the best way you knew how, and the only thing you ever got out of it was you missed underneath the refrigerator. See, if you lived with that kind of universal criticism, then no doubt you pulled out of that a negative basic assumption about yourself. Now, let me ask you, what do you think might be that negative basic assumption that a person would live with, would pull out of a situation where they're always criticized? Doesn't it make sense that what they would come out with is some basic assumption about themselves, that they're inadequate, that they're flawed? Maybe they would come out of there with a basic assumption that I can't do anything right, I'm just a screw-up, so why try? And of course, these are going to be the people that always fail and that never will try. Maybe they come out with a basic assumption that says, you know, since everybody criticizes me, you can never trust anyone. And so they take that through their life, and they are the most untrusting people who therefore are unable to function in healthy relationships. So if you can relate to this universal criticism, then ask yourself, what is the basic assumption about yourself that you pulled out of that? All right, here's the next one, second one. My feelings were discounted. That somehow in the family that I grew up in, my feelings never counted. And what I mean by that, if I was in pain, somebody was sure to say, you think that hurts, by God, I'll give you something to cry about. Or somehow the feelings were discounted. If you really wanted a new dress, you were told, not really important, or don't be so sensitive, or don't be stupid. Somehow the feelings didn't matter. Well, again, it doesn't take a PhD in psychology to understand if what you learned was your feelings aren't important, then you also learned you aren't important. So if you have a high number on that particular one, that my feelings were discounted, what might be some of those negative basic assumptions that you pulled out of that? And probably, again, it very, very well is. Somehow I don't count. Somehow my judgments about how important things are is invalid. So we wind up becoming people who don't trust our own judgments. We wind up being people who have learned feelings are dangerous. So we resist every possible way from ever sharing a feeling with someone else. Again, it's not nuclear science, it's fairly well easily understood, but it's where shame and guilt come from. All right, here's number 3. See if you can relate to this. Emotional unavailability of parents. They may have been physically present or they may not have been physically present. But if what you learned was your parents were not physically available to you, then chances are you learned it's not safe to expect intimacy. It's not safe to expect a hug. Chances are you learned that touch is not safe. If your parents were emotionally unavailable, chances are you learned to keep secrets. Because if they're emotionally unavailable, it's not safe to be emotional with them. You learn to stuff and to deny and to minimize. And all I'm saying again is simply, if you grew up in that kind of environment, then what kind of a negative basic assumption about yourself, about the world, would you pull out of that? And again, of course, it's things like feelings cannot be trusted, people cannot be trusted, intimacy's never going to happen, I don't have a right to be loved. Obviously I don't, or someone would have loved me. So what did you rate yourself on that one? All right, here's another one. The ways that we learn shame. That you were given expectations of what you had to know, but you were never given time to learn. People who were always expected to know, but were never given time to learn, are people who learn that they are always going to make mistakes. They're people who learn not to trust themselves and not to trust other people. Did you rate high on that one? When I do this with various treatment centers and recovering groups, that is almost universally an enormously high number. So many of us were expected to have all the answers, to be perfect, but we're never, ever given time to learn. All right, a couple of more. How about this one? Ways that we have learned shame. Body shame. And by that I mean somehow you learned that your body was not acceptable, that you were too tall, too short, overweight, teeth stuck out, ears stuck out, whatever it was. And you were hounded and made fun of most of the time about how you looked. Well, just like with feelings, if your feelings don't count, then you don't count. The same thing is true with your body. If your body doesn't count, then you don't count. So if you grew up with a great deal of body shame, then my question to you is, what are the negative self-definitions then that you have pulled out from that? All right, that is where the shame comes from. Shame is the basic assumption. Guilt is the feeling that we act out of. Now, let me suggest this to you. When you take a look at those negative definitions, then I would ask you again in your discussion to track out, to map out, how have you acted those definitions out? See, what are the specific situations in your life where as you walk through life you act out in a negative way or a guilt-ridden way? And what we often find are things like this, specifically again. Where my guilt and my shame most gets in the way is asking for my rights. That's the biggest problem that I have. That I know I have right to my opinion, I know I have a right to my feelings, I know I have a right to my rights, and yet my shame keeps me from claiming my rights. And so what often happens to me is I wind up stuffing, I wind up not being assertive, and I know this is all shame, or even when I do ask for what I want, I wind up feeling terribly guilty about it. You know, my neck gets tight, I start to sweat. Somehow I feel like I have stepped over some boundary that I don't have a right to step over. Well, where did it come from? You see, and again, that shame is that learned part. Now, oftentimes people say, again, under the heading, where have you acted this out? That where my shame most acts out is when I try to be successful. That maybe you have a goal and you have a great desire to be successful in business, or perhaps it is you have a great desire to be the best salesperson, or maybe to start your own business, or to write a book, or to publish poetry, and yet there is some hook that holds you back. And you say, I don't quite know what that is, but somehow I never get in the game. Somehow it seems like I'm always on the sidelines, a participant or an observer, but never a participant. It's shame that keeps us from doing that. If you cannot outperform that basic assumption, and the second part, you know, of this exercise, we looked, what are those assumptions, where did you learn them? And what we have pulled out of those shame-inducing situations there are, my rights don't count, you're never really going to be successful, you are not an important person. Well then, of course, when that translates into trying to make a business work or to set goals or to feel that you have rights, of course we're not going to be able to do that. That's what shame does. It fixes us in a negative thought pattern and a negative state of being. Another situation, of course, that people often mention with shame is how it affects my relationships. How it affects the way I try to internalize and to make love happen in my life. That again, for some reason, I just find that a near impossible situation. Shame and guilt will do that. Not too long ago, I had a woman come in the office, and she's in recovery and working hard. And one of the problems that she was trying very hard to deal with was a third failed marriage. And I said, Mary Lou, well, how did this third marriage even come about in the first place? I mean, you just sat here, told me that he was a drinking alcoholic and you didn't even particularly like him. Why did you get married? And she said, honest to Pete, this is the honest to God truth, she said, well, he asked. See, and somehow it never dawned on her that she had a right to say no. And not knowing she had a right to say no, and that's what shame does. That's what this feeling of guilt does. It prohibits us from claiming our rights, from asking what we do. She didn't think she had a right to say no, so she said yes, got married, and of course the thing went in the toilet, and now she has 3 failed relationships on her life. Why? Because of shame. So there's any number of situations, there's any number of areas in our life where as we continue to act out these negative learned basic assumptions, they just translate into total absolute chaos in our life. Now, again, as we've tried to do in this whole series, that's the problem. What's the answer? Doesn't do a whole lot of good to have a lot of talk and understanding about a problem and not really get into an answer. What is the answer to guilt and to shame? Well, the point again is that we have choices once we really understand what needs to be done. And here's an exercise that we have done many, many times that seems to empower people to take some choices and control of their life. With a piece of paper and pencil, or at least in discussion, redefine what your rights are. Re-script, writing out, verbalizing, getting out what your value is, correct these negative basic assumptions that you have learned. For example, let's just take this point of rights. Sit down there and write out and then share with somebody else. Here's really what my rights are. And if you have a special problem with rights, say in the face of men or anyone in authority, I have a right with every man in the world, whether they're professional, whether they're policemen, whether they're judges, doesn't matter. I have a right to voice my opinion. I have a right to my feelings. I have a right to uphold what I think or know to be true. See, at least it's a first step towards establishing that new identity. So write that out. Secondly, what is your ability and your right to be successful? Write that out. Share it with somebody else. And again, if you in fact are a shame-based person, even getting this out of your mouth is like torture. It's like those words somehow become as big as a tennis ball in your mouth. They're hard to get out. Because again, we have that hesitancy back here that says you don't have a right to this. But force it out. Say it anyway. Say, I have a right to success. And you know what? I really am an intelligent, competent person. And I really do know how to make this work. And I really can sell. Or I really am a good writer. And whether my writing ever gets published or not, I really believe I am competent and capable to do this. Write it out, share it with somebody. See, redefining. Shame is a railroad track that takes you to a part of town you don't want to go. And if your train is on that track, where else can the train go? Well, if you want the train to go somewhere else, you have to start laying a new track. And an important part of doing that, redefine. Get the new truth up there. Redefine what is your right to love. See, what do you deserve in terms of being loved, in terms of having healthy, loving relationships, in terms of your right to be loved by God and your lovability? And shame would tell us you don't have any rights. Confront it. See, get tough about that. Write that out, share it with other people. All right. A next step, a perfect antidote to shame is to do the opposite. When all of that stinking thinking starts telling you to go back and camp in the field of shame, refuse to do it. If you're tired, and you have too much to do, and somebody calls you up and says, would you make 3 dozen cookies or 8 dozen cookies for some worthy cause? And it is a worthy cause, but you're tired. Practice saying no. No, I'm not going to do that. And if somebody happens to come up to you and say, let's get married, and you don't want to, say no. See, when we start to practice, that's when we start to form the new person. Or as we start to act out. If your shame has led you to a point where you find it extremely difficult to buy anything for yourself, and it's just old basic assumptions, go out and buy something nice. Even if it's frivolous, even if it's silly, go out there and do it. Last night I was at a seminar, and there was a wonderful man there. I didn't really know him before, but he had this wonderful kind of childlike face, probably in his late 50s, and he had on a little St. Louis baseball hat. And I said, gee, that's kind of interesting. I mean, we happened to be in Minnesota, and he was wearing a St. Louis baseball hat. I said, how do you happen to have this? And he said, I grew up in Philadelphia. And at that time, at the 50s, my hero was Stan Musial, who was a great player for the St. Louis Cardinals. And in fact, back then, the St. Louis Cardinals won the World Series, world champions. And he said, the family I came from was very shame-based. You know, we never went to games. We weren't allowed to do anything that was fun. And he said, so I never had a St. Louis ball hat. And he said, I was out to the airport the other day, and I saw this hat there. And again, this man's in his mid-50s. And he said, I bought that for myself. He said, I wasn't allowed to wear this St. Louis baseball hat when I was a kid, but by golly, I can wear it now. And here he was in front of 300 people wearing his St. Louis baseball hat. I said, would you mind if I share this with the crowd? He said, I don't really care. And he had a terrible stuttering problem. Of course, lots of shame-based people do. So I shared his story with the crowd, and they all clapped. They all clapped. They thought it was the most wonderful thing in the world that this man would do this kind of behavior for himself, and it really was exciting. So, once you redefine what it is your rights are, and once you start setting some new healthy boundaries for yourself, then the second step is you get into action. The second step is then you start doing the kind of behaviors that teach you your rights, that teach you your assertiveness, that marches you away from that shame and away from that guilt. Now, I think the last step in this to defeat shame, to get away from shame, is the support. You should have seen that man's face last night when I told that story, and everybody clapped and applauded. He just absolutely glowed. It was just fun to see. What I'm asking you is, where is the group that you have, the support that you have, that is thoroughly and completely supportive and positive toward you? See, if your group are not your best cheerleaders, then chances are you're in the wrong group. That kind of support where there is the constant feedback that you really are a wonderful person, that whatever it is that you learned in the past, it's not true, that you are intelligent, you're competent, you deserve to be loved. We need that kind of support system. With that support system, share with them what your plan is. Say, all right, here's what I learned, here's where the shame came from, here's where the guilt comes from. And all guilt is a feeling, leads us backwards. Not that feelings are our enemies, but in recovery, if we lean too hard on our feelings, they will only take us back where we came from. Feelings only know what was. When we get into recovery, we cannot let our feelings be the sole dictator of our behavior. So guilt is a feeling. When we go out to get something new for ourselves, when we invite somebody to be in a relationship with us, and maybe we feel we aren't worthy, the feeling is going to be guilt. But see, we can fight that. And that's what I'm saying with this support system. If it's going to be healthy, it must be positive. Secondly, as I said, share with them what your game plan is. Share with them, here is what I am going to do on a more or less regular basis, and that kind of behavior is the technique that I am going to use to overcome shame, then number 3, and this I think is a critically important point and aid to recovery, make sure there is some accountability. And what I mean by that is once you share your plan with that group, then at least on a weekly basis, check in with that group to make darn sure that you are doing the behavior that you have made a commitment to do. If we consistently do the behavior that we have committed to, we will make progress. The happiness that you enjoy is your choice. Depression, by and large, is a choice. Happiness is a choice. Choose to be truly free. Choose not to live in shame and guilt. In order to facilitate the internalization of what we've tried to get across, let me summarize this lecture in 3 questions. And again, the point is, the more you can take these questions, share them, tear them apart, put them back together, the more you are empowered to make the changes that are necessary. All right, here's the first question. Define shame. See, what really is shame and what really is guilt? It's not some magic handcuffs that falls out of the sky. As long as we make it magical or unknowable, then we have made ourselves incompetent and incapable of changing it. It can be understood. So what really is the nature of shame? Here's the second question. Shame promotes decisions. When we act in a shame-based manner, we make lousy decisions. The question I would ask you to think about and share in some manner is this. In what way have you made bad, negative, self-defeating decisions because you were trapped in shame? See, make it personal. If it's not personal, it's not real. Here's the third question. Since we do have the power to make other choices, what are the new choices that you could make not being a shame-based person? What are the positive new decisions you could make to march away from shame? And we really can, you know.